Welcome to Heaven's Point of View. This is a continuation of the series Love, Marriage, Sex, and Divorce According to the New Testament. Our special guest and host this moment is Dr. Tom Shepard, who is Professor of New Testament Interpretation at Andrews University. My name is Dr. Senez Rodriguez, and I am glad to be his co-host.
Okay.
So, question for you, Dr. Shepard. Mm-hmm. We have seen so far what Jesus teaches about divorce. The question is, does Paul agree with those teachings?
All right, good question. We studied Matthew 19, verses 3 to 12. We were talking about what the Lord answered Pharisees when they came to ask him. And now we want to turn to the book of 1 Corinthians, where the Apostle Paul also discusses the question of divorce. We've already studied some about this church of Corinth. They were people with lots of troubles. Mm-hmm. They had doctrinal problems, but not only doctrinal problems, but practice problems. They had people involved in incest, and people involved in going to prostitutes, and people who didn't think marriage should have sex in it at all. And then there were people who were considering divorce, or maybe who had been divorced. So there were all kinds of issues. So Paul worked with these churches, not just Corinth, but other places, to have stable, happy homes. And some of their settings, as we will see, differed somewhat from what the Gospels talk about. And this is what brings about some of what the Apostle Paul has to say. So we want to read the passage. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 16. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 through 16. Why don't you read that for us?
Sure. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband. And if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother have a wife that believe not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which has a husband that believed not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife?
Mm-hmm. All right, very interesting passage. Talking about several different scenarios, and we're going to walk slowly through this passage and take a look at it. It's helpful to outline 1 Corinthians 7 to get an idea of how Paul puts his arguments together. We remember that this is a transition point in the book. We studied 1 Corinthians 6, 12 to 20, and we saw how Paul brought all kinds of theology together to fight the problem of promiscuity. And then in the beginning of chapter 7, he begins by saying, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. They wrote him a letter asking him a variety of questions. And he responds to those questions here and elsewhere. So the chapter 7, seems to break down into three parts. I say seems because it's disputed some as to exactly how the chapter should be broken down. But it goes like this. The first section is to those who are married or who have been married, all right? And that goes from verse 1 through verse 16. So the first part is about sex for husbands and wives, another passage that we have looked at. Marriage and the formerly married is in verse 8 and 9. And divorce and believers is in verse 10 to 16. So that's the first section, focused around people who are married or who have been married. Then there's what we might call a transition section, talking about God's call in the life setting. That goes from verse 17 through verse 24. And he starts off with a thesis that a person should remain in the state that God has called them in. And he unpacks this with an expression talking about the circumcised and the uncircumcised, the slave and the free. Then he comes to the last section of the chapter, to those who are unmarried. He starts, and that goes from verses 24 through 40. He begins with the discussion of virgins, and then he turns to relating to the distressful time. So the virgins was in verses 24 to 28. The distressful times, verses 29 to 35. Then staying single or getting married is a topic he discusses in verses 36 to 38. And finally, he talks about widows at the very end, verses 39 to 40. Okay? So this is the breakdown of the chapter. Now, Paul addresses in chapter 7 particular questions that the Corinthians had raised. And he introduces these questions with the word about. In Greek, it's peri. That word appears in verse 1 and again in verse 25. So the things you wrote about. If you look at verse 25, it says, now concerning the betrothed, so concerning, see, about the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. It seems, however, that either he answers other questions that they didn't raise, or he expands on the topics into areas that he wants to address with the people, because he seems to go a little afield from, just the particular questions perhaps that they raised. The outline that I've just, you've seen perhaps on the screen there, and I've read through it, the outline divides the chapter into these three main sections, focusing mainly on the married in the first part and mainly on the unmarried in the last part. But this outline can be challenged a bit because he refers back to married people at different times in his presentation. The passage we're looking at today, though, is a section for married people. Paul uses the verb to be married or to marry, and he puts it in what's called the perfect tense. Now, in Greek, the perfect tense had two ideas within it. One was an action in the past that came to completion, right? And then there were ongoing results that continue up to the present. So we're in the ongoing results of that experience. So both of these ideas were in the Greek perfect tense, and it depends on the context as to whether it's a consummated perfect, the one that focuses on the completion of the action, or an intensive perfect that focuses on the ongoing action. Probably here it's an intensive perfect. He's saying, he's speaking to the married. So they were married, that happened some time back, and they're still married. So they're in the state of marriage, and so he writes to them. There are a number of misunderstandings about this passage, just as we saw that there were misunderstandings about verses 1 to 6. We already studied that, but we'll see that there's misunderstandings here too. So it's good that we have an opportunity to talk about this and talk them through.
Now, sometimes the idea of such misunderstanding is troubling to some people in today's church. They think, well, if this is the word of God, shouldn't the meaning be crystal clear to everyone so that no one is lost?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are truths in the Bible that are impossible to miss if one is reading with an open mind and a willingness to do what is right. Jesus said in John 7:17, if any man wills to do his will, he will know the doctrine, whether it is of God or I speak of myself. So Jesus there expresses the concept that, you know, it doesn't matter how much you know. You can have a PhD and all kinds of things and everything, but if you're unwilling to do what God requires, you will likely find some way to escape and get away from what He has said. All right? So there are certain truths of the Bible that are just impossible to miss. These include things like the doctrine of sin, the teaching about salvation, the gift of salvation, forgiveness, our responsibility to love other people. These are written large in the Bible, and it would take, you would have to be really resistant to not be able to see those, okay? But some teachings of the Bible require deeper study, a closer look, careful look at the meanings of the words. You notice as we talk here, we talk many times about the meanings of the words. We don't only talk about the meanings of the words, but we talk about how they're related to one another, how the different terms relate to each other. The background story, the history, the culture. It's not a denial of our faith for us to study and read and look for information that fills in the background. We have to remember that these books were written 2,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. Paul was writing to a particular church in a particular setting with particular problems. He wrote to them with instruction from the Lord that met their needs, responding to the questions that they had. But his writings contain principles and teachings that apply to us today, giving us what God's will is for us in these matters. So, yeah, some passages are just a little more obscure, and we have to search at them. That's why we have a program like this and looking carefully at the Bible.
Yeah. Now I noticed that in the outline that verses 8 and 9 are words to the unmarried. Do you think that Paul was in favor of celibacy?
Well, let's take a look. Let's read those two verses again. Verses 8 and 9. I don't think we read them before.
I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide, even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn.
Yeah, probably the last part is to burn with passion.
Right.
You know, to be consumed by the passion. So Paul recommends to the unmarried that they stay single. He does not explain much here why. But in verses 17 to 35, he presents 4 different reasons for staying single. Let's just read a little bit of that. Let's read verses 17 to 24.
Okay, 17 to 24.
And we're listening particularly for the question of why should they remain single?
Okay. But as God had distributed to every man, as the Lord had called everyone, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandment of God. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God.
Okay, so here is his first reason that he gives, and it's basically wrapped up in the idea, remain in the state in which God called you. But while he says that, almost immediately he modifies that a bit because he talks about the slaves.
Right.
And he says, well, no, you don't have to stay in slavery. He says, if you can get freedom, he says, go for it. You know, that's a good idea. And then he gives one of his typical kind of things where, you know, the person who is a slave is the Lord's free man, and the man who is free is the Lord's slave, Christ's slave. So he, you know, puts in instruction here as he goes along. But that's one of the reasons he's suggesting the idea of staying in the same state. Now the next one is found in verse 26. Why don't you read verse 26 for us?
Verse 26. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be.
Yes, to remain because of the present distress, that the person should stay in the state that they're in. There was a famine in the area in 51 AD, and Paul may have written just a few years later there were famines in that area, and we know that distress like this makes it difficult to form relationships and to have a marriage because you have to plan in advance for proper care. Then verse 29, why don't you read that? That gives another reason.
But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none.
Yes, this seems to be like an eschatological kind of a context, looking towards Jesus' return. We might wonder, well, wait a minute, Jesus didn't come at that time, did he? Did Paul expect him to come right then? Actually, in one of his other letters, Paul says that there has to be the man of sin has to show himself first, and so he looks for a later time. But perhaps he's thinking in terms of people's life where it was, and we all know that when our life comes to an end, that's when the next thing we'll know is Jesus' return. So he puts in here the shortness of time, he says. Another reason he's suggesting. And then the last one down in verse 32 and 33.
22?
32 and 33. Read those verses.
But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the Lord, how he may please his wife.
Yes, okay. Now, he's talking about earthly anxieties. You know, when you get married, you have to think about the family.
Of course.
And the care of them. When you're single, you pretty much are much freer to do a variety of things. So for these four reasons, remaining with God in the state where you were called, the present distress, the shortness of time, and being without earthly anxieties. Some people get the idea that Paul was down on marriage. But these arguments and the verses around them don't suggest that. Paul was a missionary. He was a pioneer, and big in his eyesight, big in his view, was the ability to move quickly from place to place and do the work of God. You read this man's life story and where he went, it would have been extremely hard to do with a family and to travel around with them. And so he was a little freer in that sense, being single. Now, he doesn't say that a person has to be single. He says there's no sin in getting married. You should get married as a Christian. You should marry a Christian. You should be married, he says, in the Lord. But he doesn't say that marriage is wrong in somehow.
Now, I notice that Paul uses the phrase, not I, but the Lord, in verse 10. And then he says, not the Lord, but I, in verse 12. What does that mean?
Yeah, let's read those verses again so that people get the whole context. Let's read verses, well, start with verse, I was on the wrong page. That helps.
10?
Yeah, verse 10.
Okay.
Read verse 10 and then read verse 12.
And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband.
All right, and then verse 12.
But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother have a wife that believe not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away.
Yes. Now, this is really interesting. I mean, it almost sounds like two levels of inspiration or something, you know. There's the Lord's command, and then, well, I'll just give my opinion, you know. But what we should do first is ask the question, who is the Lord that he's talking about here? In another place, the apostle uses this term, the Lord, and refers to a command from the Lord, and it refers to the Lord Jesus Christ. Turn over to 1 Corinthians 9:14. 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 14.
Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel.
Okay, so the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So is there some command of Jesus that parallels that? Well, it seems there is, over in Luke 10, verse 7. So turn to Luke 10, verse 7 and read that verse. So notice that Paul is saying that those who work in the gospel should get their living from the gospel. Okay. Now, what did Jesus say in Luke 10, verse 7?
It says, "And in the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his hire. Go not from house to house."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this principle of the laborer is worthy of his hire, and that the people where you go as a gospel minister and you're serving their spiritual needs, they should help you with their physical needs. And that's in Jesus' missionary discourse here to the 72 that he sent out, besides the 12 that he had sent out earlier. And that is so parallel to what the apostle has said in our passage in 1 Corinthians 9, that it seems that in the background is this very saying of Jesus. Now, most scholars maintain that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians before Luke was written. But there were oral traditions and the teachings of Jesus in the minds of the apostles, and they were teaching these things. And so it's quite interesting that even before a written gospel, the Apostle Paul has some kind of understanding of the Lord's message. So then the question becomes, okay, if this is the Lord Jesus that he's referring to in 1 Corinthians 7, if this is the same person as the Lord's as Christ, then well, what's he referring to? All right, so we go back to look at Paul's words here, and he says, to the married, and verse 10, to the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord, the wife should not separate from her husband. Now, actually, a little later, we'll take a look and see exactly what teaching of Jesus, it's in our next program, I believe. We'll take a look and see what teaching of Jesus it is that this links up to. But if he's talking about the Lord here, it's indicative that he's giving precedence to the words of Jesus. I like that. He's giving precedence to the words of Jesus. But he notes that his own words also have a certain weight to them. Okay, so there's two verses where he helps to show what he thinks of his own sayings, of his own words, and that's in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 25.
Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that has obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful.
Yes, mine reads a little different. It says about the same. It says, now concerning the betrothed or the virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Okay, so he didn't have a saying from Jesus to talk about those who were unmarried. And in fact, if we look through the Gospels, we don't find a saying. We find Jesus talking about divorce. We've already seen that. he discusses that. But we don't find a saying where he says, no, so what should unmarried people do? And so Paul says, I don't have a command from Jesus. If I did, I'd give it to you. He says, but I give my own judgment as one who is, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy. So someone that they can count on. Somebody might say, well, that doesn't sound as authoritative. That doesn't sound as inspired, So now we go down to the other verse, and that's verse 40. And maybe we should get the context here, starting in verse 39.
Okay, 39. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she so abide, after my judgment. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God.
Okay, so if you look at verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. That's in accordance with the teaching of Jesus. Okay? And he says, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. That reminds us of Romans chapter 7, where he talked about the two different people, and one could be married, and then the person dies, and then they can remarry. But in verse 40, he says, yet in my judgment, now he's going to go beyond what Jesus was talking about, yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And here he kind of puts tongue in cheek a little bit and says, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So he's an apostle, but he struggled with the church in Corinth. They had issues about his authority. Paul knows who he is. He knows he's an apostle. He knows he has the Spirit of God. There's not two levels of inspiration. It's one level of inspiration, but the difference is whether he has a direct saying from Jesus, and if he does, he focuses on that saying. So next time, actually, we're going to notice how Paul ties his teaching into the teaching of Jesus.
Well, our friends, we are coming to an end to this particular presentation today. We thank you for being with us. And I am sure that if you stay with us for the rest of the programs, you are certainly going to be spiritually uplifted and benefiting from the presentation that Dr. Shepard has for us. So I invite you to stay with us, and you will enjoy it. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you have a wonderful day today. Thank you, and may God bless you today.